Okay, let's take a look at the first couple pages of Chapter 5, The Needed Reform of Logic. This is not a chapter I've spent a lot of time with in the past, so I guess will be good to give it a thorough reading. I tend to basically accept Dewey's argument that logic needs to be reformed, but, well, I've never quite looked at all the details. In this chapter, he goes into Aristotelian logic, shows its cultural basis, and how Aristotelian logic is tied to that cultural foundation of ancient Greece, and shows how the context is much different today and that we need a new kind of logic in today's world with today's new kind of science. So he's not doubting the importance of Aristotle, but he is trying to point out the limitations of what could be accomplished at that time, and that today we just need something different, which is going to be kind of provided, at least the beginnings of that will be provided in the rest of the book, in later parts of the book. So let's take a look at this first couple of pages here about the needed reform of logic. So Dewey says, there are not many today who would echo the saying of Kant about logic. Since Aristotle, it has not had to retrace a single step and has not been able to make a single step in advance, so that, to all appearance, it may be considered as complete and perfect. So that's Kant, quoting Kant there. And Dewey is saying not many people would agree that Aristotelian logic is essentially perfect. Nevertheless, the prestige of that logic is still enormous. It forms the backbone of most logical texts that are taught in the schools, with additional chapters on inductive logic, which are introduced apparently out of a feeling of need to pay some deference to what are supposed to be the methods of modern science. So Dewey is saying, and I haven't gone back to look at the logic textbooks at the time to see if this is true, that they're based on Aristotle's logic with a little bit of an addition on inductive logic, basically empiricism, which shows some deference perhaps to developments in modern science, but is not really good enough, not radical enough for what Dewey says we are going to need. Going on. Even those who realize the imperfections of classic logic in, for example, its assumption of the conception of fixed substances as necessary subjects of every proposition, do, nevertheless, pay homage even in their formal symbolic statements to traditional forms, contenting themselves with revisions and additions here and there. So there are people who realize that there are some problems, some imperfections in classic logic, but their response to this is to make small revisions and additions here and there. Those who, like John Stuart Mill, have systematically criticized the traditional theory and who have attempted to build a logic in accord with modern scientific practices have disastrously compromised their case by basing their logical constructions ultimately upon psychological theories that reduced experience to mental states and external associations among them, instead of upon the actual conduct of scientific theory. So a little bit of a criticism of people like John Stuart Mill there. I don't think I need to say too much about that. Yeah. It's not really that interesting to me, so let's continue. No apology is needed, therefore, for discussion of Aristotelian logic in relation to the theory of logic developed in this volume. So, basically, he's saying, he's giving the reason why he's going to discuss Aristotle, basically, right? It's still important today. Logicians still base their work on Aristotle, so we need to discuss Aristotle. For the former enters so vitally into present theories that consideration of it, instead of being historical in import, is a consideration of the contemporary logical scene. Right? Aristotle is still with us, or was at that time, probably still is. I don't know, I haven't taken a logic course in a long time, so I don't really remember. But anyway, Aristotle is still important, so we gotta kind of discuss him and put him back in his proper place, so to speak. The competency of traditional logic as an organ of inquiry into existing problems of common sense and science is an urgent question. This chapter is accordingly a critical exposition of the main features of the Aristotelian logic in reference, 1, to the conditions of science and culture which provided its background and substantial material, and 2, to their contrast with the conditions of culture and science which now obtain. So we're going to look at Aristotle and Aristotelian logic in terms of, as he says, the conditions of science and culture, which kind of supported that particular kind of logic, and how that contrasts with what is happening now with culture and science today. The first point involves the attempt to show the intimate and organized way in which the classic logic reflected the science of the period in which it was formulated. The organized way in which classic logic reflected the science of the period in which it was formulated. So we're going to look at how classic logic reflected the science of the time. Now remember, Dewey has been trying to show how logic comes out of ordinary experience, comes out of various kinds of inquiries, common sense inquiries, scientific inquiries, and then goes back into that. So, of course, under this theory, if we were to look at ancient Greek culture, we would see a particular kind of logic coming out of that type of society and the type of science that they had evolved or developed. All right, so the second point concerns the revolutionary change that has since taken place in science as the ground for a correspondingly radical change in logic. Right, and then we're going to look at how science has undergone a revolution since the time of the ancient Greeks, and how that necessitates a radically new kind of logic. So, a recent writer on logic has said, "Science seeks today to establish, for the most part, what are called laws of nature. And these are generally answers rather to the question, under what conditions does such and such a change take place? Or what are the most general principles exemplified in such and such a change, than to the question, what is the definition of such and such a subject, or what are its essential attributes?" Well, I guess let me finish this quote. The quote goes on, "It is more in respect of the problems to be answered than of the logical character of the reasoning by which we must prove our answers to them that Aristotle's views, as represented in the topics, are antiquated." So this writer, let me just look up who it is. Oh, H.W. Joseph. That quote is from a philosopher or a logician. I'm not sure who this is really. H.W. Joseph, An Introduction to Logic. So, an old logic textbook. The idea being, as he says, that the methods of logic haven't changed much or don't need to change much, but the questions that we ask have changed. While the questions we ask have changed, it seems that the logical methods are still relevant, are still suitable. Right? So we've started to ask different questions about laws of nature rather than what are the essential attributes of some thing. But the method that we can use is still the logical method we can use is still the same. Right? The logical character of the reasoning So yeah, the problems are different, less so the logical character of the reasoning by which we must prove our answers to whatever new questions we want to ask. So then Dewey goes on, the implication of this passage, especially when it is extended to apply to logical works other than the topics, would seem to be that a radical change in the problems and objects of inquiry, like the change from unchanging substances and their necessary essential forms to correlations of change, can take place with little change in logical forms. Right? So again, the idea that we have a change in problems without a change in forms. And Dewey is saying, no, we have change in forms, we have change in methods for dealing with, we have change in problems and methods for answering and trying to cope with those problems. And we must have also changes in the logical forms that we're using. This implicit assumption that the logical forms are fine as they are, they don't really need to change very much. This implicit assumption is characteristic of much current logical writing. A contrary postulate is the ground for the present examination of Aristotelian logic in its relation to Greek science and culture in the 4th century BC. The more adequate that logic was in its day, the less fitted is it to form the framework of present logical theory. This is an interesting observation at the end here. This is where I'm going to stop for today. There's actually, in the printed text, there's more of a break between these two paragraphs. So the next part goes on to getting into the details of Greek culture. But yeah, this last idea is thought-provoking, right? The more adequate, you could broaden this out, the more adequate that some idea is to its own day, some method is to its own day, perhaps the less fitted it is to later times, especially times that are much different, right? This would make sense. We live in a much different kind of world in many, many ways compared to the ancient Greeks. So it would seems reasonable to claim that the more adequate that Greek logic is to that world, the less adequate it will be to our world, which relies on a very different kind of scientific inquiry, a very different understanding of science, and is based on very different kinds of technology than the Greeks had access to. Not that the Greeks were so primitive, but it was just a different world, a different culture, with different problems that were thought to be important. So, yeah, I would leave you with that intriguing idea, and in the next videos, we will get into some of the details of Greek culture and logic, and then the changes subsequent to that, which, according to Dewey's ideas, will require a radically different kind of logical theory. Okay, so it's a bit of a short video, just the kind of introduction to this 5th chapter, but that's all for now. See you in the next one.